we were talking about heavenly voices, and we ended with the mention of Ezra. I can't quite find it now. Where is it? There it is. Let me get the Gemarah on the screen for you for a start. There it is. One sec.
Page 55.
Thank you. Page 55 in the Steinsaltz Gemarah that we like. There it is. So we had this bat kol. We had this heavenly voice, which we spent quite a little bit of time on, discussing why it was a bat kol and not a ben kol, and about the echo, bat kol being an echo. And in one way or another, it's the bat kol was a lower form of communication with God than Ruach HaKodesh, which is mentioned here, whatever that means, and Nevuah, prophecy, whatever that means. I understand the bat kol as being a voice, a heavenly voice. So all these rabbis were sitting around, and it was almost like there was a loudspeaker coming from the ceiling, and a voice came out and said these words. That's how I understand it on a practical basis. And what the point of this bat kol was, well, that's another matter. We discussed last week the idea that each generation potentially has somebody who could be a leader, call it Mashiach if you wish, a leader to bring peace to the world, to bring messianic times, let's call it that, as opposed to be a Mashiach. The word Mashiach, of course, anybody know what the word Mashiach actually means? What is the root of the word and what it actually means? Anyone?
Is it anything like Shaliach?
It is anything like Shaliach? No, not really. It's got a shin in it.
Yes, you're shy. Straight.
Yashar, straight. No, it doesn't come from that word.
Is it messenger?
No, that would be malach.
Doesn't it have the concept of returning our people to sovereignty? Doesn't it have sovereignty as part of it?
Well, that's one of the jobs of the Mashiach.
That it's not necessarily a heavenly time, but it's a political sovereignty.
Yeah. Those are all the things that are meant to happen during the Messianic times. What I'm asking is the root of the actual word Mashiach.
Anointed.
Say again, Avril?
Anointed.
Yes, anointed. That is absolutely right. Mashuach. A mashuach is it means to be anointed. Thank you. It's what that was done to the Kohen Gadol. It's what was done to the king. We'll see in the Tanakh Shir next week, if we get there next week, or if not next week, the week after, that Saul will be anointed. Mashiach means the anointed one. Of course, it's translated in English as the Messiah, but of course, that's just a transliteration, really, of the word Mashiach. Messiah is just a hey at the end, of course, is chet, so Mashiach is transliterated, not translated, transliterated as Messiah. But the actual word means anointed, and it means the anointed one of, obviously, the anointed one of God. The anointed one is the appointed one, of course. Today, even in the UK, some of you may remember the coronation. I don't. I wasn't born, but some of you may remember the last coronation that we had in 1953, June 1953, if I'm not mistaken. And the Queen would have been and was anointed with some kind of oil by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And of course, that is taken from the Bible. Christianity being a daughter of Judaism, UK being a Christian country. And So that's why the queen or monarchs are anointed. So the word Mashiach means anointed one. How did we get into that? Because we were talking about this bat kol, which said that in every generation there is one person, or oh no, that's not what the bat kol said. The bat kol said in this generation there is somebody who is fitting to be like Moshe Rabbeinu, to have the Shekhinah upon him, i.e. The chosen one, the anointed one, the Mashiach. Ela she'ein doro zakai lakach, but his generation didn't deserve him. And that's what the bat kol said, and we had a discussion last week about the implications of that. We spoke about the Lubavitcher Rebbe in his generation. We spoke about Rav Sachs in his generation. And of course, there are others in every generation who might fit that bill. And this particular generation is talking about Hillel HaZaken. And we spoke a little bit about Hillel and Shammai, the last of the pairs of the Tanaim. And Hillel was a very great person. And when he died, he said, Hey Chassid, hey Anav, Talmido Shel Ezra. Woe, we have lost the pious one. Woe, we have lost the humble one. He who was the pupil of Ezra. And I'm just going to shut the door because of the builders making a noise. There we go. And we spoke, I suggested to you that you might want to read up a little bit about Ezra, because Hillel has been compared to Ezra here. And Leon is going to read you two paragraphs from the introduction to the Art Scroll book of Ezra. Those of you who have a green Art Scroll Tanakh like that, that's the small version. I think Leon's got the large version. It's just before page 1814. Leon, your suggestion to read this out was absolutely spot on. Tell us a bit about Ezra. You're muted, Leon. There we go.
The book of Ezra, Nehemiah, brings us to a pivotal turning point in Jewish history. It begins an epoch that, in a sense, is still with us, because the glories of David and Solomon were never regained. Even after the Second Temple was rebuilt in 349 BCE, the level of holiness of the First Temple era did not return. The Jews were still under the domination of a foreign power, and so it was to remain during most of the years that the Second Temple stood. It was only due to the kindness and generosity of King Cyrus that the temple could be built at all. That the return to the land took place at all was thanks to the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra was so great that the Talmud describes him as worthy of having received the Torah, had not Moses preceded him. Nehemiah gave up a prominent position as a royal courtier for the sake of coming to the land of Israel and rescuing the minuscule settlement from demoralization.
Carry on, carry on.
Carry on.
Yeah.
Right. The nation was not worthy of a total redemption. That will come only at the end of the current exile. Even when the royal edict was issued allowing the Jews to return to their land, only 43,000 accepted the offer, a tiny fraction of the nation. Shocking? Most certainly. This was an indication of the sorry state of the nation under foreign domination. But there was a blaze of greatness unrelated to temporal sovereignty. Ezra and Nehemiah were members of the Anshel Knesset Hagadolah, men of the Great Assembly, a council of 120 men, many of whom were prophets, which functioned over several generations and rejuvenated the nation. They prayed successfully that the craving for idolatry be abolished, which is why the idea of such worship seems so outlandish to modern man. They composed the standard prayers, and most important of all, brought about the dramatic flowering of the oral law. which was and remains the primary repository of divine wisdom. Ezra was one of the supreme teachers in Jewish history, and he and the men of the Great Assembly returned the crown of God's greatness to its former splendor by teaching successive generations to seek his beneficent hand behind the mists of history and the ephemeral ascendancy of the wicked. That teaching will illuminate the universe when the final redemption is at hand.
Okay, that was a good summary, I think, of the situation with Ezra. Although I think it was towards the end somewhat overstated, because all of the things that you heard there was some very interesting things that we should just expand upon a bit. First of all, I'd like to just expand upon the idea which we've spoken about before, to get it straight in our heads that the time of the Second Temple was not the greatest in history. We mourn it greatly on Tisha B'Av, but actually there was a lot to be desired, left to be desired during that time. The level of holiness was low, the level of corruption was high, the level of independence was low, the level of foreign dominion was high. So it wasn't a great time, but it was better than not having a temple at all, and it was better than not being in our land at all. And as is written there, Ezra was very instrumental and very important in the return to Zion, and to the fact that it was the success that it was, or the limited success that it was. He's known as Ezra HaSofer because he was a sofer, he was a writer, he was a scribe, he was also a Kohen, and he was the greatest of his generation. He was, as is implied in this bat kol, he was the Moshe Rabbeinu of his generation. And as the Gemara says, as the introduction says, the Gemara points out that there were a number of people who were fitting to have been the one who received the Torah from God. Ezra was one of them. Rabbi Akiva was another one, which is very interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, Rabbi Akiva was a complete Am Haaretz, a complete ignoramus until he was aged 40. And yet he rose to be the Moshe Rabbeinu of his generation. So that's also something that's interesting. I just want to expand a little bit on the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. These were the 120, the 120 men of the Great Assembly. They basically, as far as rabbinic Judaism was concerned, Pharisaic Judaism was concerned, they were the legislative body. They were the ones that put the prayers together. They were the ones that decided what was in and out of the Tanakh, which, just as an aside, we're coming up to Hanukkah in the not too distant future. That's why the book of Maccabees never made it into Tanakh, because it was the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah that decided, and they were not all that kindly disposed to the Maccabees, to the Hashmonaim. And so we'll talk about that in some detail during Hanukkah, maybe. But the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah were a very powerful body. They made the prayers, they put together the Shmona Esra, they put together the Tfilot. It was Ezra himself who, what's the word, brought into law, ordained, no, not ordained, whatever it is, the word is, I can't think, it just escapes me. He was the one that decided that we should have laning, Kriyat Torah, every Monday and every Thursday, which we still do, of course, to this very day, including this morning. So that was instituted. That was the word I was looking for. It was Ezra that instituted that tefillah, that Kriyat Torah on Monday and Thursday, because when he came along to Eretz Israel from Bavel, they'd already started. They'd already come back together with Zechariah and Haggai that we spoke about last week. But they were in a very, very sorry state spiritually. And Ezra wept about this and didn't just sit there and weeping into his coffee. He also actually did something about it and started to teach. He was a teacher par excellence, and he instituted Monday and Thursday laning so that there would never be more than a 3-day period where the Torah was not read, because it was read every Shabbat, every Monday, and every Thursday at a very minimum, including not counting the days of Rosh Chodesh and Chanukah and Purim and all the other times that we and the Chagim. So there would never be a time when 3 days there would not be the Torah. Why did he choose 3 days? Why not 2 days? Why not 4 days? Anyone know why Ezra chose 3 days as the maximum time that they could not go without hearing the Torah? It has its basis in the Torah itself. David?
I thought Monday and Thursday were the market days when everyone was in town.
Yes,
so
that's true. That is true. But I think there may be a chicken and egg here, Johnny. It may be market day because there was laning on it. No, seriously, I mean, remember Ezra started this off, in 400 and something BCE. The market days that were fixed in the time of the Second Temple were much, much later. So I think that it wasn't so much that they laned on market days, but they put market days on laning days. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. David is going to tell us why Ezra chose 3 days.
Immediately after Kriyat Yamsuf, it says Vayelechu Shloshet Yamim Bamidbar V'lo Matzu Mayim. They were in the wilderness 3 days, and they couldn't find any water. And Ein Mayim El Torah.
Very good. Couldn't have put it better myself. After Kriyat Yamsuf, straight away, what happens is and in fact, the strange thing is about Kriyat Yamsuf is that the parsha does not end with Shirat Hayam. You'd expect the parsha to finish. The end of Shirat Hayam, the end of Az Yashir, you'd expect that will be the end. It goes on to say, and then they went 3 days journey into the wilderness after Kriyat Yamsuf, and they didn't find any water. And so what did they do?
They complained.
They complained, like all good Jews do. They complained. And the strange thing is that, and it's even stranger when we read this on the seventh day of Pesach, which is all about Kriyat Yamsuf. The seventh day of Pesach, the laning is the Shirat Hayam, the song at the sea. You would expect it to finish at the end of it comes into a crescendo. It comes into this great climax that we were all saved at Kriyat Yamsuf. As Yashir Moshe B'nai Yisrael et Hashira Azot, we sing this beautiful song, this poem to Hashem, and then we come crashing down with a huge crash that says, oh, and after that they went 3 days without water and started moaning. And all the Mefarshim asked the question as to, why spoil the party? Especially on the Chag. You're celebrating Kriyat Yamsuf. Why put a pin in the balloon and spoil the party and tell us that we were complaining after 3 days? And Ezra took this idea, V'lo matzu mayim, they didn't find any water. And as David said, water is compared to the Torah. And if you go for 3 days, says Ezra, without hearing the Torah, without finding water, without listening to the Torah, that will bring on complaints. It will bring on lack of spirituality. You will fall from that high level of spirituality that you attained at Kriyat Yamsuf. We know that at Kriyat Yamsuf, the most simple servant saw visions that Yechezkel ben Buzi, the great Ezekiel with his wonderful visions of chariots and the Kisei HaKavod. The simple servant saw greater visions than that even. In other words, everybody was wonderfully uplifted, but they came crashing down with a big bang. And Ezra said, okay, that's telling us that we can't go for 3 days without hearing the Torah, and therefore he instituted this minhag, this halacha, that the Torah should be read every 3 days at least. So every Monday and Thursday, that's when we have laning. Johnny is right that was the market days, but I think that it was the other way around. I think market days were in those days were made those days because people would go in to the village, from the villages to the larger villages. I won't call them towns, but relatively speaking, towns, so that they could hear the Torah. And while they're there, you've got your customer base. You put up your market at the same time. So you're right, Johnny. The two things were definitely interconnected, but I think they were interconnected the other way around. So that was Ezra. He and Nehemiah was his sidekick. That was Batman and Robin, like we spoke about the other day. Batman and Robin coming to save the people from the downfall that was befalling them because their level of spirituality was so low. Ezra taught. He wrote Sifrei Torah. He instituted the laning. The Anshe Knesset Agdolah, the over the generations, basically put together the Ma'agala Ashana, the cycle of the year that we have, and the Tanakh that we recognize is largely down to the Anshe Knesset Agdolah. If Moshe Rabbeinu was to come down and look at what we do, he might not recognize it so much. But if Ezra was to come down, I think he would recognize it much more. And if Rabbi Akiva was to come down, he would recognize it further. And of course, this is a demonstration of something which, as you know, is close to my heart. The fact that Judaism is a dynamic religion. It's not a static religion. It's not something which is, if you'll pardon the pun, fixed in stone that can never change. It does change. Sure, it needs an Ezra. It needs a Rabbi Akiva. It needs an Anshe Knesset Agdolah. It needs a Sanhedrin. It needs a Rabbeinu Gershom. It needs great people to change it. You can't just have any Tom, Dick, or Harry deciding what he wants to do and change things. But change is not only inevitable, it is positive if it's done in the right way. And what we have today, the beauty of our religion, think about your own lives here. Everybody here is from Chutz La'aretz of one way or another. Think about the Judaism of your childhood and compare it to the Judaism that you have today. And I'd be surprised if you wouldn't tell me that it was very different. I'd be disappointed if you didn't tell me that today's is an improvement on the previous version. But that's how we're meant to be going. We're meant to be dynamizing and moving along. And this is an example of it. The Anshe Knesset Agdolah instituted things. Imagine how revolutionary they were in their day. Imagine how revolutionary Ezra was in his day. And imagine probably, I don't know, but probably the flack he got, it was probably called reform and conservative and all sorts of things. Rabbeinu Gershom, when he said you can't have more than one wife, he was no doubt given stick for that. But great people can take the stick, and if they're great enough, then their changes will continue for positivity. Okay, so that's Ezra. We had a little digression into Ezra. At this point, Hillel HaZaken is compared to Ezra. Where did we start this whole Gemarah from? Let's just whiz up here. And we started from a chap called Shmuel Hakatan. Remember, we went through a few different examples over here of times where somebody spared the blushes of somebody else. They acted in a very altruistic and modest way in order to spare the blushes of others. Shmuel Hakatan was singled out as being one of those great people, and he was then compared to Hillel HaZaken, and then Hillel HaZaken has been now compared to Ezra. So we're going, you can see where we're headed now. We're headed down various different comparisons, and at the same time, we're talking about the idea of the bat kol. So let's carry on and see what the next bat kol, the next heavenly voice, has got to tell us. I didn't find a satisfactory answer to Jeffrey's question about why they were in Jericho, since Jericho was in Cherem and wasn't meant to be rebuilt. But I think that we did at least answer the question as to why they were in Guriah's house, because Guriah had a big house, and this was the main, gathering of the sages. So it would have been presumably a large palatial place, or if not palatial, at least large enough to accommodate them. The next one, they're not in Jericho. They are in an aliyah. They are in a loft, or in a attic space, or whatever it is, an upper floor. So we are here in 11a. Sorry about the drilling, if you can hear it in the background. We're on 11a, and we're on page 55 if you're following, and it's on the screen for you now. Shuv pam, another time. Achat hayu shuv pam achat. Sorry, there was one other occasion. Hayu mesubin. They were lounging around. Ba'aliyah beYavneh. They were in an attic in Yavneh. Now then, where's Yavneh? Anybody know where Yavneh is? Marcel, where's Yavneh? Unmute yourself and tell us where Yavneh is.
It's south of Ashdod, south of Ashkelon.
Okay, very good. It is indeed. What was special about Yavneh? What were they doing in Yavneh? We don't know what they were doing in Yericho, but we perhaps know what they were doing in Yavneh. What were they doing in Yavneh? Anyone know? What is Yavneh famous?
They were learning there. They were learning there.
Yavneh is where Ben Zakai got smuggled out of the burning city in order to establish a center of learning.
Yes, Aaron, yes. Yes, very good. There is the famous story which we usually relate on Tisha B'Av, that when the Second Temple was about to be destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai was smuggled out. He was smuggled out in a coffin, and he approached Vespasian. I think it was Vespasian. Correct me if I'm wrong, somebody. I think it was Vespasian, who at the time was the governor, and he said, "Hail to you, Vespasian, the emperor." And the emperor, no, he wasn't the emperor right that second. Vespasian said to him, "Chutzpaniak." He says, "I should put you to death twice. Once for saying that I'm the emperor when I'm not, because that's disrespectful to the emperor. And once because if I am the emperor, why have you not come to pay me homage before now?" So get out of that one, Ben Zakai. And just at that moment, a messenger comes racing along on a trusty steed to the Vespasian, and he says words to the effect of, "The emperor is dead, long live the emperor. You, Vespasian, have been appointed to be the emperor. Long live the emperor." So Rabbi Yochanan was actually right. He was the emperor, and the reason he hadn't been to pay homage to him up until then was that he's only just been made the emperor. So Vespasian was obviously very impressed with Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai, and he said that you are obviously a very great man. I will grant you 3 requests. A bit like the genie in the bottle here. I will grant you 3 requests. And what did he request? Well, okay, imagine that you were Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai. You were the leader of the Jewish nation at this time. You've been smuggled out of the besieged city, which is on its knees, starving of hunger. I don't want to go through all the horrible things that were going on. You can read them in the Kinot, what was going on. It was a dreadful time. And Jerusalem is under siege. It's about to be destroyed. Clearly, that is the plan of the Romans. And there you are in front of the newly appointed emperor, and he gives you 3 wishes. I will grant you 3 requests. What would you, if you were Yochanan Ben Zakai, what would you request? Julia, I'm going to put you on the spot straight away. Julia, unmute us and tell us what your one of your 3 requests.
To stop the barricade of the city of Yavneh, to allow food.
Jerusalem was.
Oh,
sieged,
sorry, sorry. To stop the barricade of Jerusalem and allow food and water in.
Right. Okay, that would be a sensible request. What another request? What else? Who would like to give me another suggestion for a request if you were Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai? Nachum, what would you ask for? A clarinet.
That's a tough question because I don't know all the circumstances are there, but in some way relieve the Jewish people of their torment at the time in Yerushalayim. But I don't know specifically what.
Right, so I'll accept that. Save Jerusalem. Save Jerusalem. Okay. Anyone else want to give a suggestion as to what Rabbi Yochanan might have requested?
My suggestion, sorry, can I just say that my suggestion was not what he might have requested, because it's obvious from what you're asking that it wasn't any of those things. It's what I would have requested.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, Julia. You didn't request that. And it would have been my request too, probably. So I'm with you on that. Sharon, you want to give a suggestion?
Yes, I think that what he would have wanted particularly was to save intact the Sanhedrin, the deliberating body, and the legal scholars, knowing that the temple cult was going to fall, that he would want to save the rabbinic scholars who were then formulating the new Judaism in the face of the reality of a huge Roman Empire.
Okay. That is, of course, exactly what did happen. Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai asked for, was granted 3 things. And he said one of the things that he requested, and that's why we're talking about this. He requested to save. I can't remember exactly who it was. Somebody help me out. Somebody, one of the great Tzadok, I think it was Tzadok HaKohen, or somebody HaKohen anyway, who had been on hunger strike and fasting for the Jewish people, and he asked for him to be saved. To be healed, and he asked for a second thing that he asked for. I can't remember the second thing, but the third thing was, and the main thing that he asked for was, he says, "Give me Yavneh v'chachameha, give me Yavneh and its sages." And this, as Sharon has very beautifully pointed out there, this was damage limitation. I would have asked for him to save Jerusalem. Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai, and in fact, when he went back and told the story to the sages, some of his colleagues said, "What are you doing? Why didn't you ask for him to save Jerusalem? You had an opportunity. He said he'd grant you whatever request you had. Why didn't you ask him to save Jerusalem?" And Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai understood, unlike these people who asked him this question, that was a request too far, that would not be granted. It was not possible. That ta'alich, that process of the destruction of Jerusalem, had gone beyond its pivotal point. It had gone beyond its center of gravity, as it were, and it was unstoppable. I'll come to you in one sec, Marcel. It was unstoppable, and therefore it was not possible for Vespasian, even if he'd wanted to reverse that process. Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai was a man of great vision and understood that. And so what he said was, give me Yavneh and its sages. In other words, allow, exactly as Sharon has said, allow the sages of the time safe passage out to another place, to Yavneh, where we will reconvene. And that is where, as it were, the new Judaism, if I could be so bold as to call it that, the new post-temple, post-Bet HaMikdash Judaism was to take place and was to formulate and was to come into existence. Yavneh v'chachameha, Yavneh was the seat of learning after the destruction of the Second Temple. And this request from Vespasian for Yavneh v'chachameha, Yavneh and its sages, was a request which, the results of which we are still benefiting from today, because it was in Yavneh, through those great men, through those great sages who put together the Mishnah, who put together later on the Talmud, who put together all the programs of the year, the whole of rabbinic Judaism that came after the destruction of the Second Temple, started in Yavneh with Chachameha, with its sages. So that is why Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai requested that. It was a request of incredible prescience and incredible foresight, and understanding that there was a process that had already begun that was irreversible, that the destruction of the temple could not be averted, even at the word of the new emperor, and therefore he didn't request the obvious, which I would have requested, and that many of the sages also thought that he should have requested. But because of Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai's foresight and prescience, we have the Judaism that we have today. So that is what they were doing in Yavneh. How did we get onto that little digression? Because we mentioned Yavneh. There is a yeshiva in Yavneh today called Kerem B'Yavneh. Kerem means a vineyard in Yavneh. This is how the Yavneh of Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai's time was described, as a Kerem B'Yavneh, a vineyard. What is a vineyard? A vineyard is something that goes on, a vine goes on forever and ever and ever, or for a very long time, and then you take shoots off it and it carries on and it gives grapes, and then it gives wine. Wine, of course, is the drink of kings. So
is that not the Bnei Akiva yeshiva?
It is not a Bnei Akiva yeshiva as such. It is I think you would call it a Dati Tzioni yeshiva. I went there for a short while. In 1977. Can't say that I really used my time to great benefit there. I was more interested in going off to the kibbutz, as far as I was concerned, better attractions in those days. And of course, I regret that today, having wasted an opportunity. But there you are. As my blessed memory father used to say, you can't put an old head on young shoulders, and I had very young shoulders then, and I wasted the opportunity. But Kerem B'Yavneh is a well-established, modern Orthodox, modernish Orthodox religious Zionist yeshiva. Many fine alumni have come from Kerem B'Yavneh, and it's called Kerem B'Yavneh. It's called a vineyard in Yavneh. That's the yeshiva's called Kerem B'Yavneh, or KBY, as it's known colloquially. That is in Yavneh, and that is in the spirit of Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai. So that's what they were doing in Yavneh. So let's just carry on. Once they were sitting around in the attic room in Yavneh, and the bat call, the heavenly voice came upon them from heaven, and they said a very similar thing to the previous one. Yesh kan, there is here, echad, one of you, shera'ui shetishra alav shechina, one of you who is fitting to have the Shekhinah upon them, the divine presence upon them. Ela she'ein doro zakai lekach. Only your or his generation is not deserving of such a thing. Now, that is almost exactly the same as the previous bat call. There is a difference. What is the difference?
One mentioned Moshe.
Yes, that's right. It's a bit like those pictures that you see, you know, spot the difference, and you've got to see where, you know, somebody's only got one eye or something. So over here, the second one doesn't say that.
You're frozen, Johnny. You're frozen, Johnny.
It may be the builders.
Yeah. Might be a divine voice.
Do you find the rabbis who were saving the Jewish people at the time? I look at them as being highly responsible for the problems that the Jewish people were having, that they ended up being destroyed by the Romans. What happened to us? Weren't they gullible for what happened? I mean, why are we looking at them with such honor and not looking at what they did? And then he saves his own. No, I don't see that either, huh?
And the Romans were conquering everyone around the world. They ruled the world, really.
But But God would have protected us. We had plenty of people running all over the world, and they never got a chance to bother us. Even Rommel didn't come in here, and he had the greatest tank organization. They couldn't come here. So God could have protected the Jewish people, but their leaders were no good, and they didn't handle the people in a way where this wouldn't have happened. No matter who the power is. Look how we got this land back. A bunch of hardly knowing what they're doing, and they ended up defeating the British and the whole the story. It's a miracle. Wait, I gotta get the door. Maybe the Mashiach is coming. Hey, it's the Mashiach. But I call her Nechama, but she's the Mashiach. Nechama, you brought me flowers?
Yeah, for Shabbat.
The Mashiach is coming. Okay.
Should somebody notify Johnny by text that we haven't got him anymore?
I think he knows.
Do you think he knows?
Of course he does.
Okay. I don't know. He might just be talking and we're not receiving anything.
Excuse me, everybody. I've just spoken to Johnny. He said he's trying to connect. Please don't go.
Yeah.
Did you hear that?
Way he was talking the way. Oh, it's a class?
Yeah, it's a class.
They're beautiful flowers.
Yeah, thanks.
And white.
Yeah, I told you the Mashiach was coming.
My wife has never bought me flowers on a for a Shabbat.
Hello, everyone. Sorry about that.
It's back.
I think my builders cut off the internet whilst they were drilling around there, and I've now rejoined on the mobile hotspot. Marcel wanted to say something. Well, let me just get my thoughts back to where we were. Oh yes, I said that this was Yeridot Hadorot. This was a descending of the generations. So the reason it doesn't say Moshe Rabbeinu is, although this person was fitting to have the Shekhinah upon them, they weren't as they weren't as great as Moshe Rabbeinu, and therefore it doesn't mention it in this particular generation. Hillel, it seems, was like Moshe Rabbeinu. But this next chap, who we're going to see in a second, was not quite up there with Moshe Rabbeinu, although he was the best of that generation. Marcel, you wanted to say something? You're muted, Marcel.
Just a small point. When you asked why didn't they ask for the saving of Yerushalayim, and Yerushalayim was decreed by Kadosh Baruch Hu that the Beit HaMikdash would be destroyed. Now, by making a request to Vespasian to annul that, it would have put Vespasian in a status of being considered to be a god, and that's my thoughts on the matter.
Interesting.
And because the only way that a decree of a Kadosh Baruch Hu can be annulled is through teshuva, and that wasn't teshuva. It was a request, kind of a request to somebody else, to a heathen, to annul what HaKadosh Baruch Hu had decreed.
Nice. I like that very much. I think that's let's try and develop that a little bit. So Vespasian says, I'll give you whatever you wish. So you could argue, if you were Yochanan Ben Zakai, that if you were to ask for that, one of three things might happen. One, he might save them and all would be happy, we'd all be good. One, he might save them, and then it would appear, as you've said, that Vespasian is, if you like, stronger than God, higher than God. Or it could be like, I think, like the Mefarshim say about Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai, that he realized that was something that was, I suppose, he's saying the same thing in a way, that was decreed by God, and that could not be overturned, either from a spiritual point of view, because that is what God wanted at this point, or from a natural physical point of view, like we said before, that the process had begun and was an unstoppable force at this point. But I take that point very strongly. I think that's a very good point, that Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai could have been instrumental in making out, as it were, that Vespasian was on a higher level than Hashem. Nice idea, Marcel. Thank you for that. Okay.
One other thing, the Bnei Akiva Yeshiva is in Meron, as far as I remember.
There are quite a few Bnei Akiva Yeshiva. There's one just up the road from us here in Kfar Haroeh, there's quite a few of them around, and they are very fine institutions. They're part of the Hesder movement, where the boys learn and serve in the army as well. To be recommended, to be strongly recommended. And any of you who have children or grandchildren in that movement, kol hakavod. Let's carry on and see who they're talking about. Who is this person in this particular generation who is fitting to have the Shekhinah upon them, only the rest of the generation are not worthy of it? Natnu chachamim et eineihem.
Johnny, can you share the screen?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Forgot that had gone off. Have we got the screen? Yeah, can you see the screen?
Yes, we've got it. Yes, we've got it.
Right. So, Natnu chachamim et eineihem. The chachamim all put their eyes, in other words, they all looked at Shmuel Hakatan. Shmuel Hakatan, Samuel the small one. And that, of course, brings us back to that's who we were talking about earlier on up the page. Shmuel Hakatan, there we go. Remember when we were talking about the incident where they spared their blushes? That was Shmuel Hakatan, and that's why we digressed into this story. And we're now back on Shmuel Hakatan. here it is. They all looked at Shmuel Hakatan, and they realized that he was the one that was the greatest of his generation. And in the same vein as we had before, when Hillel died, they said, "Hey Chosid, hey Anav, Talmidosh shel Ezra." They bemoaned the fact that this person who was so pious and humble had died, and that he was gave him the epitaph of being a pupil of Ezra. The same idea here. They said of him, "Af hu amar bishat mitato." They said at the time of his death, meaning the time of Shmuel Hakatan's death, "Shimon v'Yishmael lecharba v'chavruhi liktala, ushar amar leviza v'akan sagian atida lemitei al alma." Okay, so this is slightly different. They didn't say this about him. They said, oh, sorry, wait a minute, I skipped a line. When he died, they said about him, "Hey Chassid, hey Anav Talmido shel Hillel." Exactly the same as it said about Hillel. In Hillel, they said, "Whoa, we've lost a Chassid. Whoa, we've lost a humble one. He was a pupil of Ezra. He followed in Ezra's footsteps." They said the same thing about Shmuel Hakatan, only it was Hillel's footsteps. So he said, "Hey, Chassid, we've lost a pious one. Hey, Anav, whoa, we've lost a humble one, Talmido shel Hillel." He was in the footsteps. He was a pupil of Hillel. So if he was a pupil of Hillel, and Hillel was a pupil of Ezra, you can see the chain of command, as it were, the chain of the generations going through Ezra, from Ezra to Hillel, from Hillel to Shmuel Hakatan. So it's a description that Shmuel Hakatan was the greatest of his generation. This Bat Kol came and said that he was the greatest of his generation. Before we just go on to what Shmuel himself said at the time of his death, which is what I just read out, and we'll do the translation in a sec, I think it's worthwhile having a look up to the right-hand side of the page about Shmuel Hakatan. Does it tell us about Shmuel Hakatan here? No, it tells us about Hillel HaZaken. Okay, so Shmuel Hakatan, why was he called Shmuel Hakatan? Anybody know why he's called Shmuel Hakatan? He was a great Shmuel. Why isn't he called Shmuel HaGadol? He was the greatest of his generation. We just read that. Why is he not called Shmuel HaGadol? Why is he called Shmuel Hakatan?
Maybe there already was a Shmuel Hakatan.
Ah, very good. And who would that be?
I have no idea, but it just seemed
yes,
logical.
you do.
Oh, I do. Oh,
Look at page
Shmuel.
54.
Regular Shmuel.
Yeah, regular Shmuel.
Regular Shmuel.
The big.
The big Shmuel.
Shmuel HaNavi. Shmuel HaNavi. So,
Look at page 54 for a description of him.
Page what? 54?
54.
Right. Oh, there we go. Right, there we go. Okay, so let's see what it says here. I knew I'd read something somewhere on this page. Thank you, Michael. Shmuel Hakatan was one of the early Tanaim. He lived during the period of the Second Temple. According to several sources, he was one of the youngest students of Hillel and lived a long life. Well, that would fit, wouldn't it? Because he actually said that when he died, they said he was a Talmid of Hillel. So that would fit. He died a short time before the temple's destruction. Okay, with respect to his moniker, that's moniker, M-O-N-I-K-E-R, not moniker as in Lewinsky. With respect to his moniker, Hakatan, meaning the small one, two interpretations are suggested in the Jerusalem Talmud. According to the first, the name reflects his superlative humility. He considered himself to be Katan. According to the second, he was considered only slightly less great than the prophet Samuel, whose name is Shmuel in Hebrew. So Shmuel, regular Shmuel, as Nachum calls him, Shmuel HaNavi, he was the great Shmuel, and Shmuel Hakatan was the little Shmuel. And if you think about it, how many times have you seen the child of somebody who looks like somebody and say, oh, he's a proper little so-and-so, right? If you see my youngest grandson, who's 6 months old, he looks like Nebuch. He looks like me when I was a little baby. And so, you know, he looks like a proper little me. And so he would be called little me. Okay. And so Shmuel Hakatan, not in terms necessarily of his appearance, but in his midot, he was like regular Shmuel, Shmuel Agadol, Shmuel Hanavi, the great Shmuel. So he's called Shmuel Hakatan. And of course, the other explanation that Hakatan, it's almost like a euphemism. He's called the small one because he was so humble, like Hillel himself. So it's fitting that he was given the hesped when he died, that he was a Talmid of Hillel. One of the greatest things you could say about a person is that he followed in the footsteps of Hillel. Now, he will just finish now with this last little bit. He himself, and I'm interested to know why you think the Gemarah has put this in, just as a matter of interest. But the Gemarah says something that Shmuel Hakatan himself said on his deathbed. And he said this, Shimon v'Yishmael lecharba. Shimon and Ishmael, two people, lecharba. The root of that word is cherev, which is a sword, means they will die by the sword. Chavruhi liktalala. And their friends, you can see chaver in the middle of that word, yes? Their friends will die liktala, that means they'll be executed. Usha'ar amah, and the rest of the people, leviza, will be destroyed, will be for spoil, will be despoiled. I think is the English word. Yeah, despoiled, that's what Rav Steinzal said. Ve'akan sagi'an atidan, and great troubles will come upon them in the future. Atidin, in the future. Lemetei al alma, will come upon the world. Great troubles will come on the world in the future. This was nothing less than what?
It's happening now.
This was a prophecy. Yeah. This was a prophecy. He's on his deathbed and he says, two people, Shimon and Yishmael, we'll talk about who they were in a minute. They will die by the sword and the rest of their friends will be executed in other ways. And the people will suffer terrible disasters in the future. This was his parting words. And on his deathbed, he was saying a prophecy. Now we know, don't we, that prophecy, real prophecy, pure prophecy, ended much earlier. We know that because it says so over here. Nistalka ruach hakodesh mi Yisrael, when at the time of Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi. Malachi was the last pure prophet. Sounds like prophecy to me, this. Now, let's have a look what he's talking about. We've gone over time, so we'll just do it very briefly. And then
was it not a warning, John? It was not a warning instead of
yeah, but it's very specific. Let's just read the English translation and see who they're talking about, and then next week we'll go into it in more detail. Shimon and Yishmael. He's talking here. Look in the translation. He's talking about the Shimon. He's talking about is Rabban Shimon Ben Gamliel, the Nasi, the president of the Sanhedrin. And Rabbi Yishmael, the one he's talking about, is the high priest. These were the two of the three great ministries of state, the other one being the Av Bet Din. They will die by the sword, and their friends, who are their friends, the other Chachamim, they will be executed. What is he talking about here? He's talking about the Asurei Harugei Malchut, the 10 martyrs that we read about in the Yom Kippur davening. The Asurei Harugi Malcha, these 10 martyrs who were killed by the Romans, not all at once, they were over a generation or two, and we'll talk about it in more detail next week. But he was predicting, not only was he predicting Soros, which you can understand as being a warning, a prediction, but he's specifically saying the method of execution of Rabbi Shimon Ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yishmael. Now that is something which sounds to me a little bit more than predictions, sounds a little bit more like Ruach HaKodesh, sounds a little bit more like Nevuah, and I think we need to discuss that in more detail next week. We need to stop now because, as usual, we've gone over time, and I don't want to delay you any longer, but it's food for thought. Next week's homework, have a look in your Yom Kippur Machzorim, in the middle of the repetition of Musaf, and you'll see the story of the 10 martyrs. We generally speaking in Nusach Ashkenaz at least, most of us don't actually say it because it's just garbled along very fast. The Chazan doesn't even say it, he just recommended reading in English, not in Hebrew, because you won't understand it. And it's an important thing. We also read it in the Kinot on Tisha B'Av, which is fitting. You can read about them, and we'll talk about that in some detail next week, and we'll talk about what you think about Shmuel Hakatan and whether he was a Navi, whether he had Ruach HaKodesh, whether he was a Bat Kol, or whether he was just a very clever man. And was he the Mashiach, or was he in fact just a very naughty boy?
Didn't some of the martyrs watch each other being killed, I thought?
Well, yes, you need to read it. There's a lot of...
I've read it in the Matzah, I thought they watched.
Yeah, there's a lot of poetic license going on there. Read the commentary in the Koren Machzor, read Sachs's commentary. Very, very interesting, very worthwhile. Any questions before we close on what we've done today? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you on Sunday for Tanakh, and see how we go from there.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.